There are 4 more weeks of action in fantasy football before the playoffs start. So whether you're making a postseason push or just looking for a deep run to the championship, you have to attack the waiver wire, and that's exactly what we do with SI fantasy football analyst Michael Fabiano. Fab's another exciting week in the NFL during week 9, but we're looking ahead to week 10. Let's start off with the quarterbacks that you think people should add.
And we've got a lot of them to lead off. Tua Tagovailoa. Last week, he only had 93 yards, Bill, and I kind of feel like it freaked people out. He was amazing against Arizona, 248 yards through the ground, had 2 touchdowns, had 35 yards as a runner, 21.5 fantasy points. He's got the Chargers coming up next. So it's Justin Herbert against Tua Tagovailoa. That one's going to be a lot of fun. Teddy Bridgewater, also worth an add off the waiver wire, had 3 touchdowns, over 28 fantasy points against Kansas City. He is now giving you 19 plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games. Bridgewater has the Tampa Bay Buccaneers coming up next. Some other quarterbacks. Derek Carr didn't have a big game against the Chargers, but he's got the Broncos next on the schedule. Drew Lock, speaking of the Broncos, 2 straight games with over 19 fantasy points, and he's got the Raiders. So Lock is worth a look. Nick Foles had the garbage time game of all garbage time games. He played like garbage for most of the game against Tennessee, but he still scored almost 22 fantasy points, and he's got the Vikings coming up in week 10. And then Alex Smith looks like he's going to be the starter for the Washington football team. His next 3 games, at Detroit against the Bengals, and then at Dallas. And, oh yeah, by the way, Jake Luton, how about this kid? Over 20 fantasy points. We never even heard of this kid, right? We didn't see him in preseason because there was no preseason. And he went out and had a tremendous game. So in 2 QB and super flex leagues, Jake Luton, my friends. I can't remember a season, Bill, where I've seen this many great performances from rookie quarterbacks.
Certainly, all that jazz about no preseason and no rookie minicamp, throw it all out the window. These newcomers are really performing well. Fabs, let's move over to running backs. I know it's always a scarce position, but you need running backs in order to win your fantasy matchups. So who are you suggesting that people pick up?
So Duke Johnson is going to be an interesting ad because David Johnson left the game with a concussion against Jacksonville. So if he's unable to go next week, Duke Johnson gets a revenge game against the Browns. How about that? So the Duke will be worth an ad across the board. Wayne Gallman, like I know that he's Wayne Gallman and he's splitting touches with Alfred Morris of all players, right? But Gallman had 44 snaps, 15 touches, and scored another touchdown. He's now scored in 3 straight games. He's got the Eagles in week 10. So if there's no Devonta Freeman, Gallman is, well, let's just say flexible. And then Gus Edwards, right? We're talking about J.K. Dobbins, like, because he has the highest ceiling. Edwards is getting the goal line opportunities. He had just under 10 fantasy points against the Colts. And because he's got a great matchup next up against the Patriots, well, Gus Edwards is going to be in the flex conversation. Some other running backs. If these guys are not owned, go get them. Zach Moss, DJ Dallas, although Chris Carson and or Carlos Hyde could be back coming up in week 10. But I can't believe I'm going to say this. Kalen Ballage is worth a look off the waiver wire. What kind of world are we living in? But Kalen Ballage led the Chargers backfield in touches and fantasy points. It's crazy. Justin Jackson got hurt early, barely played, and Kalen Ballage was more effective than Joshua Kelly. And oh, by the way, guess who Ballage has next week? Miami Dolphins. Can you say revenge game?
I can say revenge game. It's certainly getting plenty of that. It seems like in week 10. Let's move over to wide receivers. I know you have a bunch of playmakers that are worthy of being picked up.
So Curtis Samuel is somebody that we talked about very recently, and he's played well, and the Panthers are using him more. He's still available in a lot of leagues. I mean, you look at the numbers from the game against Kansas City, 60 snaps, 12 touches, nearly 27 fantasy points. He has now scored 17 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. And he's been more productive over that time than Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore, who's kind of disappeared. So Samuel is worth a look. And then you got 2 Broncos wide receivers, Tim Patrick, who had 9 targets against Atlanta, and KJ Hamler, who was an absolute beast in this game, had 15 fantasy points. Both of those players are worth a look off the wire. They have the Las Vegas Raiders coming up. Some other guys who might be owned, but just check. Christian Kirk, John Brown, both guys coming off of big games. Danny Amendola, was targeted often for the Detroit Lions without Kenny Galladay. So Amendola is going to be worth a look. Scored nearly 15 fantasy points against the Vikings. Nelson Aguilar. He has a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. I know it's Nelson Aguilar, but he's getting the job done. Michael Pittman Jr. Alan Lazard could be back for Green Bay. We'll see, but he's got the Jaguars coming up if he's active. And if he's not back, then Marquez Valdez-Scantling could be worth a look in deeper leagues.
All right, let's move over to the last position. That's tight end. Anyone catch your eye?
So Irv Smith Jr. had only 4 targets, but he had 2 touchdowns, and that's going to help. 15 fantasy points. He's now scored 10 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. He's got the Bears coming up next. But here's some players, Bill, that might be available. Check out the wire. Dallas Goedert, okay? He's only owned in 40% of ESPN leagues. Philadelphia was on a bye this week. If he's available, go get him. Austin Hooper, available in about 60% of ESPN leagues. And he could be back from that appendectomy. And before he went down, he had scored double-digit fantasy points in 3 straight games. And then Jordan Reed, I mean, this is where we're at right now. Didn't do much on Thursday Night Football, but with George Kittle out, Reed is certainly worth a look in deeper leagues.
We always get your week started in terms of fantasy football with the waiver wire, but then Fabs will have his start 'em, sit 'em. He'll have his player rankings. All of this, you can find it by going to si.com/fantasy.